He didn't even look up from his laptop when he told me security would escort me out. After 28 years of building his father's company from nothing, I was dismissed like a temp who'd spilled coffee on the copier. 3 hours later, in a glass-walled boardroom he thought he controlled, he finally learned what happens when you try to fire the man who secretly owns the company. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. The HR manager sat to his right, clutching a folder with my name on the tab. A security guard I did not recognize stood by the door, pretending to study the carpet. My badge rested warm against my chest, the same badge I had used to open the doors before he learned how to walk. He cleared his throat once, like a student before a school presentation, and began to read. He said the board had agreed that my role was part of a legacy structure that no longer matched the company's vision. He said they appreciated my years of service and wished me the best in my future career. Every sentence sounded like it had been polished by a consultant and checked by 3 lawyers. I did not interrupt. I did not ask questions. I simply watched. I noticed the way his jaw tightened each time he tried to sound confident. I noticed how he avoided the framed photo on the wall behind me, the one where his father and I stood in front of 3 folding tables and called it an office. The HR manager's hand shook slightly as she slid the folder closer to him. When he finished the script, he finally stopped scrolling and leaned back. Only then did he look at me. His expression tried to be calm and professional. He was 29 years old, wearing a title he did not understand, sitting in a chair I had earned one long night at a time. He believed the power in the room belonged to his last name. I knew better. He pushed the folder across the desk. Inside, he said, were my termination documents, a severance package, and a non-disclosure agreement. His voice grew firmer when he mentioned the last part. A smooth transition, no public confusion, no mixed messages. He spoke like someone repeating lines from a play he did not understand. He did not know that nothing in that folder could touch what was already written in the company bylaws. I opened the folder slowly, more for his benefit than mine. I skimmed the pages, saw the standard phrases about restructuring, market conditions, and leadership changes. Someone had added a paragraph thanking me for laying the foundation of the company's success. It looked kind on the page. It felt like someone carving my name off a building with a smile. I closed the folder and laid my badge on top of it. The metal clicked softly against the cardboard, a small sound in the quiet room. The HR manager let out a breath she had been holding. The security guard shifted his weight, ready for movement. The new CEO glanced at the badge, then back at his laptop as if the matter were finished. In his mind, this was the end of my story. For me, it was only a turning point. I want to do this right, I said. My voice sounded calm, almost casual. No anger, no raised tone, just a simple statement. He looked up again, surprised that I was speaking at all. I nodded toward the folder. You can keep the documents for now. I am sure legal will want to take another look at them soon. He frowned, confused. He asked if there was a problem with the terms. I told him there was no problem yet. I asked him, politely, to inform his father that the emergency board meeting in 3 hours should be interesting. The HR manager's eyes widened. The security guard looked from me to him, unsure what any of this meant. The new CEO forced a small laugh and said there was no board meeting on the calendar. There is now, I answered. I picked up my coat from the stand and left the folder and badge where they lay. I did not slam the door. I did not raise my voice. I walked out of the office I had occupied for years, as if I were going for a regular lunch break. In the hallway, a few employees looked up, sensing something in the air. None of them spoke. They did not have to. I already knew who they would call when things began to fall apart. When I got home, I put my keys in the same bowl by the door, took off my jacket, and stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence. No phones ringing, no radios from the warehouse, no clipped footsteps in the corridor outside my office door, just the ticking wall clock and the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. For a man who has spent most of his life in motion, stillness can feel louder than any argument. I filled a mug with coffee that had been sitting in the pot since morning and sat down at the kitchen table, the cheap wooden one I bought after the divorce, the one that still had a faint scratch where my son did his math homework years ago. They fired me today, I thought. After 28 years of building their empire, I was escorted out like a temp who stole pens. I didn't throw the mug. I didn't punch a wall. Outrage is a luxury for people who never learned to plan. Instead, I opened the drawer by my left knee and pulled out the small black notebook I've carried for as long as I can remember. It isn't some dramatic secret journal, just a habit from my Navy days. You write things down so you don't lie to yourself later. On the first page, dated almost 3 decades ago, there's a note that says, "First day, 3 desks, 1 client, no backup plan." I remember that day as clearly as the one I had just lived. It was me, Bradley, and a rented space that smelled like old carpet and fear. He had the idea and the charisma. I had the logistics and the stomach for risk. We shook hands like equals because, back then, we were. Most people see the glossy headquarters now and assume it was always inevitable. It wasn't. I remember nights when the server crashed at 2 in the morning and I drove across town in the snow to reboot it myself because we couldn't afford a proper IT team. I remember driving a busted van to deliver a critical shipment when a driver called out sick and there was nobody else. I remember signing personal guarantees on loans so we could make payroll, calculating in the back of my head how long my family could survive if everything collapsed. Every crisis we survived turned into a story for investors and a line on a slide deck. But the pain, the missed birthdays, the quiet apologies to my wife when I got home after midnight, those never made it into any presentation. My ex-wife used to say she felt like she was married to the company, not to me. At the time, I told her she was being dramatic, that the sacrifice was temporary, that things would calm down when we hit the next milestone. Things never calmed down. They just grew. One client turned into 10, 10 into 50, 50 into global contracts with people who only knew my name when something went wrong. My son stopped asking if I would be at his games. He just told me afterward how they went. When the marriage finally cracked, the divorce papers listed the usual reasons, but I know the real cause was simple. I treated stability for everyone else like a sacred duty, and treated my own home like something that could wait. I took another sip of the bitter coffee and pushed the notebook aside. Enough remembering. Remembering can drown you if there's no purpose to it. I stood up, went down the hallway to my home office, and unlocked the gray metal cabinet in the corner. People think power sits in the big chair on the top floor, in the corner office with glass walls. It doesn't. Real power lives in quiet things, signatures, clauses, percentages typed in small font. The cabinet door creaked open, and there it was, row after row of labeled binders and folders, each one a moment when I chose long-term control over short-term comfort. I pulled out the oldest binder first, the one labeled Equity Early Years. Inside were copies of agreements where I took stock instead of bonuses, memos where we moved my title around on the org chart but never touched my share count. Back then, it wasn't some master plan. It was just me betting on the company instead of betting on myself. I turned the pages, watching the numbers slowly change. 5%, then 15, then 28. Each percentage point bought with weekends in the warehouse, with my name left off press releases, with "We'll make it up to you later" echoing from Bradley's office. The next binder told a different story. Transfers, buyouts, settlements. Over the years, people left. Some burned out, some cashed out. Some decided the grind wasn't worth it anymore. I didn't give speeches at their farewell parties. I sat in conference rooms with them and quietly bought their shares at fair prices, sometimes generous ones. No drama, no headlines, just signatures and wire transfers. They walked away thinking they were freeing themselves from an exhausting life. I stayed, adding their burden and their ownership to my own. 51%, 64, 72. At each jump, I wrote the new number on a sticky note and tucked it into the back of the binder, just for me. On the shelf below, another set of binders waited, labeled in the dry language of law firms. Bylaws, amendments, governance. I slid one out, its spine marked Succession Risk Protocols. The paper inside still carried the faint smell of the cheap coffee from the night we drafted it. After a cousin tried to play Prince years ago and almost tanked morale with a stupid staff purge idea, we built safeguards. We sat around a table, tired and angry, and talked about what would happen if someone unqualified with the right last name got too much power. Lawyers wrote paragraphs. Bradley nodded and signed where I told him to. He trusted me then, and to be fair, he had reason to. He knew who kept the wheels turning. My fingers stopped on a tab near the back, the one I'd marked with a strip of red tape. I pulled it open and looked at the title printed across the page in clean black letters. Section 12B, Emergency Succession Protocol. I had read those words countless times over the years, usually late at night, usually after some new flash of arrogance from the next generation. The clause was simple and brutal, dressed up in polite legal language. If a non-equity executive terminated a founding member without board approval, all executive authority would be suspended, and control would revert to the majority shareholder until the matter was formally reviewed. The majority shareholder, not the CEO, not the founder, the one who carried the biggest actual stake when the music stopped. I traced the line with my thumb and felt, not triumph, but a steady, grounded calm. This wasn't revenge written after the fact. This was a safety net I had woven years ago, thread by thread, for a day I hoped would never come. Today, it finally mattered. I closed the binder gently, set it on the desk in front of me, and sat down. They thought they had erased me with a single sentence read off a laptop screen. All they had really done was flip the switch on a process they never bothered to understand. 13 years earlier, I sat in a much smaller boardroom, staring at a younger man with the same last name as Bradley and the same dangerous belief that the rules did not really apply to him. He was a cousin, fresh out of business school, full of case studies and buzzwords. Someone on the board decided he needed real experience, so they gave him a vague strategy role and too much access for his level of wisdom. One afternoon, he walked into the warehouse with a printout in his hand and cheerfully announced a plan to fire a third of the staff to cut dead weight. He had no authority to do it. He had numbers, not names, in his head. But the way some supervisors went pale told me they believed he might actually pull it off. That day almost broke us. Word spread in minutes. People started whispering about packing up, about looking for other jobs before the axe fell. Miguel, who was just a junior supervisor back then, pulled me aside near the loading dock and said the men were scared and angry. I remember walking through that building, feeling every eye on me, knowing that trust was hanging by a thread. When a family member plays king, workers don't care about titles. They just watch who steps in and who stays silent. I stormed into Bradley's office and asked him if he knew what his nephew was doing. He didn't. He looked stunned, then tired, then furious. We spent the next 48 hours calming everyone down, reversing promises that never should have been made, and trying to convince exhausted people that their jobs were safe. Some never believed us again. After the smoke cleared, investors called. They had heard rumors about a bloodbath in operations and a purge in the warehouses. They were not calling to gossip. They were calling to ask if we had lost our minds. At the time, we were still fragile enough that a few big clients leaving could have sunk us. One of the oldest investors, Harold, said something that stuck with me. He said, "We need insurance against heirs. Not insurance against competitors or recessions. Against heirs. The kind of people who inherit power instead of earning it and then try to prove themselves by breaking things." That comment turned into a series of long meetings with lawyers and sleepless nights for me. We sat in that same small boardroom with piles of drafts, crossing out soft phrases and replacing them with hard ones. The idea was simple. If someone without an actual ownership stake tried to play executioner with the people who built the place, there had to be a break they could not reach. We did not want daily decisions frozen by fear, but we needed a way to stop a runaway train before it hit the wall. I pushed for language that would not depend on someone's feelings. It had to be automatic. Clear triggers, clear consequences. Section 12 Talk B was the result. On paper, it looked dry, even boring. It said that if a non-equity executive terminated a founding member or equivalent without prior board approval, all executive authority would be suspended immediately. Control of the company would revert to the majority shareholder until an emergency review was held. No exceptions written in the margins, no quiet side deals. The trigger would not ask how polite the firing was or whether the heir meant well. It cared only about facts, who signed, who was fired, what the agreement said about them. Bradley read it, rubbed his eyes, and asked if this wasn't a bit extreme. I told him it was only extreme if no one ever tried to cross that line again. He sighed, signed, and moved on to the next document. I did not. Back then, I was already a large shareholder, but not yet the anchor. Over the years that followed, life did what life always does inside a company. People burned out, retired, or wanted liquidity for new ventures. Whenever someone from the early team wanted to sell, I listened. I did not push them. I did not talk them into anything. I simply said, "If you are leaving anyway, I'll take those shares off your hands." Every time a deal closed, the numbers in the ownership chart shifted another step in my direction. 51% was the first important line. That meant control in theory. But I kept going. 58, 64, 69. When I bought the last block that brought me to 72, I sat alone at the same desk, stared at the figure, and felt something close to gravity settle into my chest. With that weight came a different kind of responsibility. It meant that if Section 12B ever triggered, it would not be some committee of strangers taking the wheel, it would be me, the man who had signed loans with his own name, who had smelled the diesel on the trucks and the sweat in the warehouses. I never told Junior. I don't think it ever crossed his mind to ask who actually owned what his father had built. In his head, the hierarchy was simple: founder, heir, everyone else. He did not see the quiet column in the reports labeled beneficial ownership. He only saw title boxes connected with crisp lines. This morning, before I left for the office, I printed a fresh copy of the activation letter I had drafted years ago. There was nothing dramatic about it. One paragraph stating the clause, one line noting the trigger, one request for an emergency meeting under the protocol. I signed it, dated it, and placed it in a slim folder at the bottom of my briefcase. Not because I knew today would be the day, but because the pattern had been building, and I have learned that when pressure rises, weak structures crack in predictable places. When Junior told me security would escort me out and looked back at his laptop, I felt the folder's weight through the leather. He thought he was writing my ending. All he was really doing was supplying the final condition for a process that had been waiting silently for 13 years. For the first 15 minutes after I left the building, I just walked. No destination, no plan, just letting my feet carry me through streets I had driven down 1,000 times without really seeing. The city felt slightly out of focus, like a photo taken 1 second too early. I passed the coffee shop where we celebrated our first big contract, the parking lot where I once slept in my car after a 20-hour shift. Today, those memories buzzed around me like flies, annoying but not strong enough to knock me off balance. When my head felt clear enough to think, I took out my phone and sent a short message to my lawyer. "It happened. Meet now?" He replied almost at once, "Already at the office. Come up." That quick response told me everything. He had believed, like I did, that this day was not a question of if, only when. I turned toward his building, a plain glass tower with no logo, the kind of place you never notice unless you are in trouble or trying to avoid it. The lobby was cool and quiet. The receptionist knew me by name and just pointed toward the elevator without asking questions. When you work with the same firm for decades, you stop needing introductions. On the 8th floor, my lawyer was waiting in the hallway, holding a slim folder and a cup of tea that had probably gone cold. He did not ask if I was all right. He asked one thing. Did he do it alone? I nodded. No board vote. Just him and an HR script. We went into a small conference room. Nothing fancy, just a table, 4 chairs, and a whiteboard that still had someone's half-erased numbers on it. I took the activation letter from my briefcase and placed it on the table between us. He checked the date, the signature, the wording of the trigger line, even though we had checked it 100 times before. Lawyers pretend they believe in intent, but in the end, they only trust ink. After a careful read, he nodded and said, "Section 12B is live the moment this is received by the board and general counsel. Are you ready for that?" I thought about the company, not about Junior. I thought about warehouse workers on night shift, about client shipments that could not be delayed, about mid-level managers who were already nervous about the change at the top. "I'm ready," I said. "But this isn't about teaching him a lesson. It's about not letting his lesson destroy what we've built." He seemed satisfied with that answer. It's easier to defend a client who is protecting something than one who is just attacking. He picked up the phone and gave instructions I had heard in theory but never in practice. Packets were printed, each one containing the activation letter, the key pages of the shareholder agreement, the relevant bylaw sections, and a summary memo. Staff from the firm moved quickly, sliding documents into envelopes, attaching labels with the names of each board member and the company's own legal department. Watching them work, I felt a strange mix of distance and focus, like I was watching a fire drill we had practiced for years, finally being run for real. While they prepared the deliveries, he pulled up his calendar and cleared the rest of the day. "Once those envelopes land, they can't pretend not to know," he said. "You understand that this will feel like an ambush to them, even though they signed every page?" I almost smiled. They're welcome to feel whatever they want. Feelings don't change clauses. It sounded cold when I said it, but I meant it in the most honest way. We had put this protection in place for exactly this scenario. Ignoring it now would have been the real betrayal. Couriers arrived within minutes, called in from nearby streets. Each handed a packet and a list. Home addresses, offices, the golf club where we knew at least one director liked to spend weekday afternoons. The instructions were simple. Deliver these immediately, get signatures, send back confirmation photos, no delays, we'll pass it on later. When the last envelope left the room, the air felt thinner, as if the building had exhaled with them. The process was now in motion, beyond my hands. That was the point. There was nothing left to sign, nothing left to argue. My lawyer asked if I wanted to stay in the office until we heard back. I shook my head. "If I sit here, I'll start thinking about everything I can't control," I said. "Better to give them space to react." He walked me to the door, rested a hand on my shoulder for a second, and said, "By the time you get your next coffee, someone's world will be shifting, maybe more than one someone." Downstairs, I crossed the street to a small cafe I'd used for quiet meetings over the years. It had plain wooden tables, soft music, and a view of the company's building a few blocks away if you sat by the window. I ordered a black coffee and took a corner seat. From there, I could see the top floors of our headquarters, the reflected sky and those expensive glass panels, the corner where the boardroom sat like a fishbowl above the city. Somewhere behind that glass, within the next few hours, men and women who thought they understood the company's structure would be opening envelopes that proved them wrong. I checked my watch. Less than an hour had passed since Junior had read his prepared speech and told me security would escort me out. He probably thought he was already rewriting our story, telling people about the tough call he had made to send a message. In his head, the next 3 hours were his victory lap. Maybe he was rehearsing a town hall presentation, drafting a post about bold leadership, or letting Elena congratulate him on removing legacy friction. He was walking through his own version of reality, one where titles outrun paper. In my version, the real one, a countdown had begun the moment he spoke those words. Not the countdown to my end, but to his illusion of control. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup and watched the office tower through the window. He believed he had taken everything from me with a sentence. He did not know that 3 floors below his new office, in a filing cabinet marked Governance, the company's own rules had already chosen a side. Here is what I know now, and what I guessed that day while I sat in that cafe watching the glass tower. When the envelopes left the law firm, they scattered across the city like quiet little detonators, each one addressed to someone who believed they already understood the company's power structure. One of them went straight to the golf club on the hill, where Bradley liked to spend weekday afternoons pretending the company could run on autopilot while he worked on his short game. I wasn't there in person, but I have heard the sequence from enough mouths to picture it clearly. He was on the back 9, laughing too loudly at someone's joke, when his phone buzzed 3 times in a row. He ignored the first call, glanced at the second, and frowned at the third when he saw it was from Linda, our general counsel, not some junior associate. She does not call repeatedly unless the building is on fire or the bank is. He stepped away from his friends, into the shade near a line of trees, and finally answered. I'm told the color drained from his face as he listened. Then, without finishing the round, he walked straight off the course, leaving his clubs with a confused caddy who probably wondered what kind of missed putt could rattle a man like that. At roughly the same time, other board members were having their own days interrupted. One was in a downtown lunch meeting, one was in a home office out in the suburbs, another was boarding a plane. Each of them was handed an envelope stamped Confidential Governance, watched a courier wait politely for a signature, and opened it expecting some dull compliance update. Instead, they found the activation letter, the highlighted passages of Section 12B, and the ownership chart with one column standing taller than all the others. My name sat at the top of that column, 72% printed clearly beside it, the kind of number that makes even seasoned directors sit down before they keep reading. Later, one of them admitted that he had always assumed Bradley still owned most of the company and that my stake was symbolic. He said seeing the actual percentage felt like discovering the building's foundations were made of a different material than the facade. They had been walking through hallways of glass and steel, talking about succession and brand positioning, without ever looking down at the legal bedrock beneath their feet. Now, in black and white, it was staring back at them, demanding attention. If it surprised them, it must have stunned Bradley. He reached the office ahead of some of them, still in his polo shirt and soft spikes, carrying the envelope from the golf club with the edges bent where his fingers had squeezed it. Security cameras probably caught the moment he walked through the lobby and realized half the executive floor already knew something was wrong, just from the number of calls and urgent emails flying around. By the time he reached the legal department, Linda was waiting with a printed copy of the same packet, already marked with sticky notes and underlines. She does not waste time on drama. She simply laid the pages out in front of him and walked him through the structure he had signed into existence. I imagine him flipping through the documents at first with impatience, looking for some line that would let him swat this away as overreaction. Then slowly his eyes would land on specific phrases. Non-equity executive. Termination of founding member without prior board approval. Immediate suspension of executive authority. Finally, control shall revert to the majority shareholder. I can almost hear the question he must have asked, because he asked it years ago when we first drafted the clause. And who exactly does that mean in practice? This time, instead of me answering, Linda would have slid the ownership chart closer to him, the one showing each shareholder's percentage. No stories, no explanations, just columns and numbers. His name still appeared there, of course, a decent slice from his early risk and ongoing involvement, but beside it, my column towered over the rest like a container ship next to a fishing boat. 72% does not need adjectives. It explains itself. There is no polite way to spin that ratio when the clause says majority shareholder, and no one else even comes close. He called me later and tried to joke about being outvoted in his own house, but underneath the forced humor I heard something rawer. Shock, maybe even betrayal. The truth is, he had not been paying attention for a long time. Each time someone sold their shares, Each time I quietly took on more risk, I informed the board through proper channels. Nothing was hidden. It was just boring paperwork, the kind that never makes it into speeches. He had chosen not to ask the obvious question. Who owns this now, really? While he was digesting that answer, the board members who had received the same packet were lining up their own questions. Several called Linda directly to confirm the clause's validity. She told them the same thing she later told me in that small conference room. Once triggered, Section 12B does not care about personal feelings, family ties, or public narratives. It cares only about compliance. Others forwarded the documents to their own lawyers, who came back with the same conclusion. The protocol was sound. The activation, if the facts were as stated, was legitimate. By mid-afternoon, the emails had turned into calendar invitations. Subject line, emergency board session, governance issue. Some directors replied with one-word confirmations. Others added short notes asking whether the CEO had indeed terminated a founding member without a vote. Linda's answers were careful but clear. The conditions described in the clause appeared to have been met. Their job now was not to argue with the existence of the rule, but to decide how to respond inside its boundaries. Up in his temporary kingdom on the top floor, Junior was still playing out his own script, drafting messages, perhaps planning a celebration dinner for his first decisive act. He did not yet know that his father had been dragged off a golf course by a handful of highlighted paragraphs, and that the people he thought of as his board were reading not his strategic memo, but mine. By the time he learned about the emergency meeting, the room where everything truly mattered was already moving on from shock to calculation. In the hours before that emergency session, while emails and phone calls ricocheted through offices I could no longer see, my mind drifted backward over the slow erosion that had brought us here. People think betrayal is a single moment, one sharp cut. It almost never is. It's a series of small nicks you tell yourself not to make a fuss about, until one day you look down and realize you are bleeding. One of the first cuts came years ago, at a strategy off-site I had pushed for and then watched from the edges. We were in a hotel conference room out by the highway, flip charts and sticky notes everywhere, consultants buzzing around like bees. When it came time for the vision session, someone from marketing gently suggested that maybe legacy operations could sit out that part to avoid anchoring the conversation in the past. Legacy operations meant me. They sent me to another room to work on process optimization, while the younger crowd drew diagrams about the future. I told myself it was fine, that someone had to keep an eye on the real work while they played with markers. Still, when I walked past the glass wall later and saw Junior at the center of a circle, talking with his hands, my chest tightened in a way I pretended not to notice. Later, in a leadership meeting, I watched another little cut land. I had spent a weekend drafting a plan to fix a distribution bottleneck that had been hurting our margins for months. I came in with diagrams, projections, and a simple timeline. I walked them through the steps, answered questions, felt that old rare satisfaction when people in the room actually seemed to listen. 2 weeks after that, I got an internal newsletter announcing a bold new logistics initiative, led by Junior, complete with a quote about breaking from old habits and modernizing our network. My plan was there, line for line, but my name was not. In the photo attached, he stood in front of a screen showing my diagrams, pointing like he had discovered something. I printed that email not because I needed proof, but because I knew it marked a shift. Credit was no longer just misassigned, it was deliberately redirected. Then there were the times he talked over me in meetings, not with open hostility, just the lazy disrespect of someone convinced he understood more than he did. We would be discussing warehouse safety or route planning, and he would cut in with a case study he'd read or a trendy framework, waving away the messy reality beneath it. When I tried to explain the practical limits, he would smile in that patient, condescending way people reserve for grandparents who are trying their best with technology. The first time he did it, I laughed it off. The 10th time, I stopped volunteering opinions unless directly asked. Silence, I learned, can be a form of self-defense. Elena added another layer. In her first presentation, she stood in front of a slide titled Friction Points, with bullets describing institutional memory anchoring us to outdated practices. She did not say my name, but everyone in the room knew who fit the description. She talked about psychological ownership among legacy leaders as a risk, not a resource. I saw a few glances slide in my direction, quickly flicked away. I asked one question about long-term client relationships and how they fit into her model. She smiled and said, "We'll bring those stakeholders along once we've aligned leadership." In her world, I was another piece of furniture to be moved, not a human being who had built half the house. Outside the office, the same story played on a softer frequency. My son, now an adult with a life of his own, took me to lunch one weekend. Over burgers, he told me he had read an article about burnout and late career diminishing returns. He said it might be time for me to start enjoying life instead of carrying everything on your back. I knew he meant well. He had watched me stagger through years when sleep was optional and dinner was just another phone call with the warehouse. Still, his words sounded eerily like the internal memos I had started to see, the ones talking about succession planning and transitioning legacy leaders into advisory roles. It was strange hearing the same song from two different radios. All along, I told myself I was staying for the right reasons. I wanted to protect the people who didn't have stock grants or safety nets, the ones whose careers would not survive an heir's experiment gone wrong. I wanted to make sure the company didn't get handed over to someone who thought leadership meant posting inspirational quotes while the roof quietly caught fire. Each slight, each erasure, each soft shove toward the door, I swallowed in the name of stability. I could live without public credit. I could not live with watching everything we built catch fire because someone liked the sound of their own voice. But there is a line, even for patient men. That line arrived when disrespect stopped at me and started to threaten the structure beneath all of us. Being sidelined at an offsite was one thing. Letting an untested heir swing an axe at the foundation was another. When Junior fired me without a board vote, he was not just insulting a man. He was triggering every fear those old investors voiced after his cousin's stunt 13 years ago. He was proving why Section 12B had to exist. Sitting in that cafe, hands around a cooling cup, I thought about all those moments I had minimized to keep the peace. It occurred to me that every time I chose to endure quietly, I was also tightening the threads of the safety net I had woven in the bylaws. Not out of spite, but out of a deep, stubborn belief that there should be a limit to how far entitlement could run unchecked. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, my patience for weakness. Today, for the first time, they were about to see what my patience had actually been buying them all these years. My phone buzzed on the table, skittering slightly against the wood and pulling me out of my thoughts. The first message was from Rhea. She never wastes words. "Is it true?" was all she wrote. I stared at the screen for a second, considering how much to say, and then replied, "Yes, for now. Stay calm and keep everything running like it's any other day." 3 dots appeared, vanished, then appeared again. Finally, she answered, "Understood. Ops solid. People are scared. Tell me if I need to move." Even through text, I could hear the steel in her voice. She had survived the early chaos with me. She knew what real danger looked like. The next message came from Miguel. His style was different. "He really do it, boss? People saying you got walked out?" I could picture him in the warehouse, phone in one hand, radio in the other, eyes moving across the floor while he typed with his thumb. I answered, "He tried. Nothing changes for you yet. Keep everyone focused. No walkouts. No rumors if you can help it." A moment later, "We got you. Guy's already saying if you're out, we're gone. I'm holding them. Don't make me a liar." That last line settled deep in my chest. I had not asked for anyone's loyalty, but years of showing up at 4 a.m. and standing next to them when things broke had built something stronger than any memo. I set the phone down and let those messages sit there, glowing quietly beside my coffee cup. Allies are not banners you wave in a fight. They are anchors that keep you from drifting into pettiness. I reminded myself that this was not about humiliating a young man who had never been told no. It was about making sure people like Rhea and Miguel did not pay the price for his education. That thought steadied me more than any legal clause ever could. A few minutes later, my phone lit again, this time with an email from Linda. No greeting, no fluff. Just, "Packets received by all board members. Emergency session confirmed for 3 p.m. You should be present as majority shareholder. We need your statement of facts, not your emotions." I almost laughed at that last part. She knew me well enough to know my emotions rarely made it to the front of the line, but she wrote it anyway, a reminder to both of us of how this had to look. Clean, controlled. Not a vendetta, a procedure. I finished the coffee, paid the bill, and walked back toward the law firm. On the way, I passed the side street where delivery trucks from our main warehouse sometimes queued when the docks were full. One sat there now, engine idling, driver half asleep across the bench. Life does not pause for governance crises. Packages still needed moving, shelves still needed filling, customers still expected orders on time. That constant, almost boring reality was the best argument I had for what I was about to do. Leadership can change. Work cannot. Back upstairs, Linda had already turned the small conference room into a war room. My activation letter lay open beside a printed timeline of the morning. The moment Junior's appointment became official, the moment he issued the termination, the moment the letters went out. Beside that, she had placed copies of the shareholder agreement and the bylaws, each flagged with bright tabs. "We're going to keep this very simple," she said. "Facts, triggers, consequences. If anyone tries to turn this into a family therapy session, we steer back to the documents." She walked me through the plan. I would attend the board meeting not as an employee, not as legacy operations, but as the majority shareholder invoking a clause they had all approved. My role was to state what happened in plain language. "He terminated you without board approval," she said, tapping the table. "You are a founding member under the definitions section. He is a non-equity executive. Section 12B doesn't care about tone or context. It just cares that those three conditions align." I listened, nodding, feeling a familiar calm settle over me. This was logistics, too, just of a different kind. Instead of shipments and routes, we were moving motions and votes along a set of rails we had laid down years ago. She asked if I wanted to prepare a speech. I shook my head. "I'll answer questions. I'll explain the history if they ask. But if I walk in there sounding rehearsed, it will look like this whole thing is about payback." She considered that, then nodded. "Fair point. Let the paper do the talking. You can fill in the human parts around the edges." Before I left, I sent one more round of messages. To Rhea. "Emergency board session at 3. Until you hear from me, assume operations continue as normal. No dramatic gestures. If anyone panics, tell them governance is handling it." To Miguel. "I might be in and out this week. Whatever happens, look after the crew. If anyone asks what's going on, tell them the company is bigger than one bad decision." To my son, after a long pause. "Busy day. Might hit the news internally. Don't worry, I'm fine." He replied with a simple, "Call me when you can." I promised I would, knowing that conversation would come after the dust settled, not before. As the clock moved toward 3, I straightened my tie in the reflection of the conference room window. In the glass, I did not see a man who had been defeated. I saw someone who had chosen, repeatedly, to carry weight no one else wanted, and who was now finally using the quiet tools he had built to keep that weight from crushing everyone. Outside, traffic crawled along the avenue, unaware that a different kind of traffic jam was forming in the boardroom 3 blocks away. I picked up the folder containing my copies of the key documents, slid my phone into my pocket, and thanked Linda for making the path ahead so clear. "Remember," she said as I reached for the door, "you're not asking them for anything. You're informing them of how their own system works." That distinction mattered. I wasn't going to that meeting as a supplicant hoping to be reinstated. I was walking in as the man the company's rules had quietly been pointing to for years. When the time came to leave the law firm, my legs felt steady in a way my chest did not. I stepped out into the afternoon light and started toward the building where, a few hours earlier, I had walked out as a dismissed employee with a cardboard-colored escort at my back. It's funny how short a distance 3 blocks can be when your entire life is supposed to have ended between them. Cars rolled past, horns occasionally snapping, people stared at their phones, and above it all, our headquarters sat with its glass skin catching the sky, pretending nothing could touch it. As I approached the revolving doors, I saw the same security guard from the morning standing at his post. When he had walked me out, his eyes had been fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like a man trying not to witness a small cruelty. Now he saw me coming and straightened. For a second, confusion flickered across his face. Then his radio crackled. I watched his hand go to his earpiece, his head tilt slightly to listen. Whatever he heard made his shoulders drop a fraction in relief. He stepped aside, reached out, and pulled the door for me. "Good afternoon, Mr. Patterson," he said, and this time he looked me directly in the eye. Inside, the lobby felt both familiar and subtly changed. I could feel attention turning my way like heat. The receptionist, who had pretended not to see me escorted out earlier, gave a small nod now, the kind people give a doctor walking into an emergency room. Not reverence, not fear, just recognition that something serious is happening and you're part of it. She didn't ask for my badge. That was confirmation enough that the system had already begun to shift around the new reality. Somewhere behind her desk, a monitor showed access logs updating in real time. My name would have flipped from terminated to whatever neutral word they use when you can't neatly label someone's status anymore. I headed for the elevator bank and pressed the button for the executive floor. 2 junior employees stepped in behind me, their conversation dying mid-sentence when they realized who they were sharing a small metal box with. I gave them a brief nod and stared at the numbers above the door as they climbed. One of them shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly wrestling with a question he was afraid to ask. He never managed it. When the doors opened on the top floor, they stayed behind, letting me walk out alone. Their silence said more than any gossip could. People knew something was coming. The hallway to the boardroom cut past the line of executive offices. My old one, now repainted and repurposed as some kind of innovation hub, sat to my left, glass walls showing a whiteboard filled with half-finished diagrams no one had erased properly. A few desks down, the door to the new CEO suite was half closed. Through the gap, I caught a glimpse of Junior pacing behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand carving agitated lines in the air. Elena stood by the window with a tablet, her arms crossed, her expression taut in a way I had not seen before. I did not slow down. Whatever conversation they were having now was already a step behind the one waiting in the room at the end of the hall. Outside the boardroom, Harold stood with Linda, speaking in low tones. They both turned as I approached. For a moment, I saw the years roll through Harold's eyes. The early chaos, the near misses, the nights we sat in smaller rooms trying to convince nervous investors that this thing was worth backing. He stepped toward me and held out his hand. "Chuck," he said, voice rougher than usual. "Thanks for coming." It was an odd choice of words, as if I had been invited to a dinner instead of summoned to help reset the structure of a company. Still, I understood what he meant. I shook his hand and then Linda's. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind of signal you give a pilot before takeoff. All systems checked. Proceed. When we stepped into the boardroom, the air felt cooler than the hallway. Floor-to-ceiling windows cast a pale light across the long table, where folders identical to the packet I had seen at the firm lay open in front of each seat. Directors looked up as we entered. Some faces showed open relief, others careful neutrality, a few guarded suspicion. But no one looked at me like a man who had been properly fired. They looked at me the way you look at a key witness walking into a trial. Necessary, central, unavoidable. I did not go to the chair at first. Old habits run deep. I stood near the side of the table, letting Harold move toward the head. He stopped, glanced back at me, then at the nameplate the staff had set down in front of his usual seat. Someone had swapped it out. Instead of his name, the little rectangle of metal carried mine, with a title beneath it that did not say Senior Operations or any other comforting half-truth. It simply read my name and, under that, Majority Shareholder. For a second, the room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I walked to that chair and rested my hand lightly on the back of it without sitting. "Let's be clear," I said, keeping my voice level. "I didn't ask anyone to change that plate." A few people shifted in their seats. "But Section 12B is in effect, and under that protocol, this is where the majority shareholder sits." I looked at Harold. He gave a small, accepting nod and moved to the seat on my right. Only then did I sit down, laying my folder on the table and folding my hands over it. Across from me, a director cleared her throat and asked, "Before we begin, can we confirm that all board members have received the same documents?" Linda answered calmly from her place along the wall, walking them through what they had in front of them. Ownership breakdown, succession clause, activation letter, timeline. No surprises beyond the ones they had already felt opening those envelopes. As she spoke, I scanned the faces around the table. Some avoided my eyes, perhaps embarrassed that they had never asked who held the real weight here. Others met my gaze briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between us. Whatever they thought of me personally, today I was the axis around which this meeting turned. We had just finished confirming attendance and quorum when the door swung open without a knock. Junior stepped in, jaw clenched, tie askew, eyes scanning the room until they landed on me in the chair at the head of the table. For a heartbeat, he looked like a child walking into the wrong classroom. Then his shoulders stiffened and the mask of authority slid back over his face. "What is this?" he demanded, voice already too loud for the space. "Why wasn't I told there was a board meeting?" No one answered immediately. The pause wasn't confusion. It was structure rearranging itself in real time, waiting for the right person to speak. For the first time, that person was not him. For a second, nobody moved. His question just hung there, loud and clumsy in the cool air of the boardroom. I watched his eyes flick from face to face, looking for someone to give him the cue he was used to seeing, the small, deferential smile that said, "You're in charge here." What he got instead were guarded expressions and a few lowered gazes. Finally, Harold spoke, voice steady. "This is an emergency session under Section 12B, he said. "You received the notice, Bradley. Check your email." Junior snorted and waved a hand. "I don't care what someone titled it," he said. "I'm the CEO. Emergency sessions go through me. I decide what's on the agenda." He shifted his stance, planting his hands on the back of a chair as if claiming a patch of ground. Then he looked straight at me. "And I thought you'd been escorted out. Why is he sitting there?" I let the question hang for a heartbeat. When I answered, I kept my voice low and even. "You thought wrong," I said. "You acted as if you had the right to terminate a founding member without a board vote. You don't. That's why we're here. I tapped the folder in front of me lightly. You didn't just mistreat an employee, you triggered a protocol. He laughed, but it came out sharp and thin. Triggered a protocol? Come on. I exercise my authority. This company needs change. Everyone knows it. Those contracts under my name, that appointment letter. Linda stepped forward from the wall, cutting in without raising her voice. Your appointment as CEO is valid, she said. But as we've discussed before, it is derivative. Your authority comes from the board and operates within the constraints of the shareholder agreement and bylaws. Section 12B outlines specific limits. She gestured toward the documents in front of him. One of the assistants had quietly pulled an envelope to his usual chair while he was making his entrance. You should read them before you make further assertions on the record. He ignored the envelope, eyes still fixed on me. You're letting legal semantics derail progress, he said. I made a necessary decision. He's been holding us back for years. Everybody in this room knows it. I have the mandate to modernize this company. You, he pointed a finger across the table, are part of the old guard we need to move past. There was a time when that would have stung. Today, it simply sounded like a script he had practiced too many times in front of a mirror. I folded my hands together and leaned forward slightly. You can call it whatever makes you feel better, I said, but the facts are simple. I am defined in this agreement as a founding member. You are a non-equity executive. You terminated me without prior board approval. Section 12B says that when those conditions are met, your executive authority is suspended and control reverts to the majority shareholder until review. He opened his mouth to argue again, then paused, something small and uncertain flickering behind his eyes. There's no majority shareholder, he said, but it came out less certain than he probably meant it to. Dad owns most of it. The rest is split. Harold cleared his throat. Brad, he said quietly, using the nickname he reserved for private moments. You should sit down and open your packet. There was something in his tone that made the room even stiller. Junior looked at him, then at the folder, then back at me. Some of the color was draining from his face now, like someone slowly loosening a valve. Reluctantly, he pulled out the chair and dropped into it, snapping the envelope open with more force than necessary. Papers slid out, the activation letter sitting on top. He skimmed, flipping pages too fast to absorb them, until the ownership chart slid into view. His eyes moved across the columns, down the percentages, then jerked back up, confusion crossing his features like a passing shadow. His thumb pressed into the page as if the numbers might smear and change if he pushed hard enough. 72? He said, almost under his breath. Then louder. This has to be wrong. This can't be right. How does he have 72%? He looked up, first at his father, then at me, as though one of us might confess to a prank. Bradley's mouth was a thin line. It's right, he said. We approved every transfer, every buyout. You were copied on the notices. Junior shook his head. I thought he just had some symbolic stake, I thought the family... He stopped, suddenly realizing how that sounded in a room full of independent directors and investors who had spent real money on their positions. The silence that followed was heavy, not cruel, just loaded with the weight of his misunderstanding. Linda took that moment to continue, her voice as clean and precise as ever. Under Section 12B, she said, once the conditions described in the letter are met, the CEO's authority is automatically suspended pending emergency review. That has occurred. Until this board concludes that review, Mr. Patterson, as majority shareholder, holds interim control under the protocol. That includes authority over executive appointments made in the last 48 hours. He slammed his palm lightly against the table. You can't just strip my role because of a technicality, he said. I made a strategic decision. I acted in the best interest of the company. That's what you all wanted, isn't it? Someone willing to make hard calls? I met his stare without raising my voice. You made a call, I said. But strategy doesn't override governance. You don't get to rewrite the foundation because you're excited about the paint color. You wanted to show everyone you were decisive. Instead, you showed exactly why this clause exists. One of the independent directors, a woman who had spent her career steering companies through difficult transitions, leaned forward. This isn't about whether change is needed, she said, looking from him to me. It's about whether you followed the rules you agreed to operate under. You didn't. That puts all of us at risk. He turned back to me, eyes bright with a mix of fear and anger. So what now? He asked. You just walk in here, wave a piece of paper, and I'm supposed to pretend I'm not the CEO? I let a small, tired breath out through my nose. You don't have to pretend anything, I said. The protocol doesn't care what you call yourself. But inside this room, right now, your decisions are suspended until this board decides otherwise. You wanted to be treated like a real executive. This is what accountability looks like." He opened his mouth again, but Harold raised a hand. "That's enough for now," he said. "We've established the facts. We understand the trigger. The next agenda item is to vote on whether to uphold Section 12B in full and rescind your appointment pending further review." He looked around the table, then back at me. "As majority shareholder, your vote will be recorded first." I felt every eye in the room settle on me, even Junior's, sharp and desperate. I kept my gaze on the papers in front of me for a moment, steadying myself, then lifted my head. "I vote to uphold Section 12B as written," I said, "and to rescind his appointment until we decide if he's fit to hold that role at all." The words were simple, almost bureaucratic, but as they landed, I could feel the balance of the room tip, the way a loaded ship slowly shifts when its cargo moves to one side. Hands went up around the table, one after another, slower than I expected. The CFO hesitated, glanced at the ownership chart again, then raised his hand too. Finally, only his father remained, thumb pressed into the paper like it might bleed. Our eyes met, carrying every exhausted year between us, and he slowly nodded. His hand rose, sealing the vote, and something fragile slipped out of his posture. "Unanimous," Harold announced, voice flat, as if reading weather instead of rewriting a legacy. Across from me, Junior sat very still. Finally understanding titles had never been enough. Security was waiting in the hallway when we filed out, the same two men who had walked behind me that morning. This time, they hovered a few steps from Junior's chair, eyes on Harold, not on him. "Your access will be limited while this review is ongoing," Harold said gently. "HR will brief you." It was mercy wrapped in procedure. Junior stood, movement stiff, and for a moment our eyes met. I didn't gloat, didn't lecture. "Let them walk you down," I said quietly. "You'll want your exit to be clean." He swallowed, nodded once, and followed them out. The next morning, I parked in the same spot as always and walked in before sunrise, like I had for most of my life. No escort, no whispers, just the soft echo of my steps in the empty lobby. Upstairs, my old office door now carried a new plate with my name and the title we had all been pretending I didn't already hold. I spent the first hour on the warehouse floor with Miguel, then in ops with Rhea, making sure nothing slipped. They hadn't needed a new king yesterday. They'd needed someone who remembered this place was never a throne.